All right, Master Gardener trainees. This is part 3 of pruning. Pruning large trees. I've said this several times in the modules. Pruning large trees do not exceed 20% of the removal of the foliage. No, I don't expect you to count every last leaf. You can eyeball this. Okay, so you go 22%. This isn't rocket horticulture. Don't sweat that small amount of detail. But for quiz purposes, the answer is do not exceed 20% of the removal of the foliage and the wood on pruning of large trees. So let's look at this before we go into any major discussion. Which way is this pruning technique likely to cause the growth to go? Let's go back to the clown and the balloon analogy that I had in the last module. Orient your balloon the long skinny way pointing up and down. If you squeeze the balloon at the base and have the part way above on top, extending a few inches, it's going to squeeze it up, right? So what are we telling this tree to do? Grow upward. Is that your objective in this particular pruning technique? It could very well be. For example, you want to go up and over a house or a structure or up and over a street for that matter, so trucks and cars and everything can pass safely underneath. So that may be a good way to prune this particular plant. Just know which way you're squeezing it. This is what we call crown lifting. Now my father, I pick on him a lot over the years in Master Gardener training and other presentations. He wanted to sit on his riding lawnmower and not have any tree potentially clunk him in the head while I was riding around mowing his lawn. So his objective was a lot of crown lifting. I talked about thinning a little bit earlier in the last module. I'm not a big fan of it because by and large it's done improperly by most people. The lower left-hand picture is what is called lion's tailing. A lot of people think this is a good idea. It's a very poor idea. The goal probably in thinning was to get more light down to the grass to get it thicker. What happens is somebody gets in there and removes all but some small branches at the very tips of all the major limbs. Now, let me try to give you an analogy of what's going on. How many of you ever watched the Olympic swimming races where they're doing the Australian crawl? That's where your face is down, your hand is going hand over hand over hand, and you turn to the side every other stroke to breathe. They don't do it every time to breathe because it slows them down, but they're going over, 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 breathing over. You get where I'm saying. Now, how many of you were kind of doing that with me? Okay, you weren't, so pretend you're doing the Australian crawl in front of your computer. Just don't hit the screen with your hands like I nearly did just a moment ago while I'm miming this and talking to you. How did you have your hands? A lot of you probably cupped them with all your fingers together and just form a cup. Well, you would think that would be a good way to get a lot of pushing for momentum forward. But if you look at Olympic swimmers nowadays, they do something to their fingers that is different than that they used to do just a few years ago, maybe about 2 decades. Somebody figured out hydrodynamics and all that, I guess. What they do now in the Australian crawl is they spread their fingers wide apart. Does that kind of look like those lion tails? It does, doesn't it? Okay, so there's kind of an analogy here. When you spread your fingers apart and pull it through the water, you actually have more resistance through the water, which gives you more forward momentum. If you leave all but a few branches at the tips, it's much like having all the weight of the wind right at the edges of the branch limbs. That works like a fulcrum at this point. So what happens is you're making it more wind left. What you're doing is making it less wind tolerant. If you lion's tail, the picture in the middle is kind of a before. The after, or the correct way to thin, if it's absolutely necessary, and you know my personal and professional feelings about that, is we leave branches and limbs throughout the canopy of the trees. This actually makes the trees relatively wind resistant on the right. They're not very wind resistant when they're lion's tailed. By and large, most people, when they get them thinned, they end up with lion's tails. Not a good thing. So, we've talked about this. Which way are we squeezing the balloon? Right, downward. We're trying to tell the plant don't grow so fast or grow so tall. Now, can I take a 50-foot tree and keep it at 3 feet with this technique forever? Not unless I bonsai it, but we've talked about that in botany. What about crepe murders? Maybe rather than crepe murdering every year like clockwork in the winter months, maybe we should be doing crown reduction or drop crotches instead. Instead of having to do this on an annual basis, we'd only have to do it every once in a while to maintain the height of the tree properly and yet still have good flowering. Drop crotching for height control. Let's review some things. So I want to remove that upper particular branch, so I bring it down to a crotch. I need the remaining limb to be what diameter of the removed limb? 1/3 the diameter. That is correct. That may come back to haunt you. I mentioned this already. You might get water sprouting on some of these plants. Usually I see this in fruit trees that have typically weak apical dominance. However, crepe myrtles also have weak apical dominance, so you might see it on them as well. So here's a tree, obviously further north, but they go dormant, and the red lines indicated where the branches were removed in a process of drop crotching. Can you see how the tree didn't grow so tall? This could be very beneficial, especially if there were power lines. Also, this could be beneficial so it doesn't catch so much wind during those wind named events. I pretty much covered that. Even with proper drop crotching techniques, there will be some decay occurring inside the particular plant. When its drop crotches are done at a roughly 45-degree angle, as a left-hand photograph shows, you can see it's a relatively small but compartmentalized amount of decay, aka rot. Now this looks like it's a flat, kind of pointed thing, but this is more like those paper cups that are a cone and pointed. So that's more of a cone shape. So think of that in a three-dimensional world, not a two-dimensional world of your computer screen. When you drop crotch in properly and leave flat cuts, this is where that particular area will remain wet for extended periods of time, causing more decay within that particular plant. Can you fix crepe murders or improperly pruned trees or shrubs for that matter? The answer is yes, but you need to know what you're doing and it's time consuming. This usually means more money. So when the bid process goes on in many developments and neighborhoods, guess who gets the bid? Person with the lowest bid. Usually he does it fast and cheap. That doesn't necessarily mean it's good. So let's look at the diagram on the left. Here was a crepe murder from, let's say, this particular growing season. And you had, where there was one sprout, you have three or four. In this diagram, there's only three. You're going to create one new leader for the future. So you want to face it generally outward from the tree so it's not growing inward if it's a multi-stemmed tree like crepe myrtles. You would remove one and then you would reduce one. So my rule of thumb is you leave one, you remove one, and you reduce some. In some cases, you may have 4 or 5. What you're doing by leaving some is keeping that hormone balance where you're signaling to the tree, please don't send up any more dormant buds. Apical dominance is established by what's still here that remained and not removed. So what will happen is the next year you'll get, during the current season, you'll get some more growth out of your new leader and those new lateral branches. Eventually you might remove those what is called new lateral branches over the next couple of seasons. Eventually the new leader will form a new branch. It takes several years in the process to do so, and you'll actually get a branch collar on those trees that form it. It's kind of interesting that they're able to do that. What to remember of heading cuts? Very good. Ouch. So here we have a tree on the left hand side of the screen. We can see it grew fairly tall, and gee whiz, there's either a cable or electric line or telephone lines or who knows what. And the tree grew into the electric line, and can that be a problem? Well, okay, so we don't want our cable to go out, or electricity or phone, so they sent the maintenance guy out from this particular apartment building or condo, and what did he do? Whack! Of course, he just whacked it off flat and left that there and said, there, I'm done, I've controlled the height, it's no longer in the power lines, as you can see in the upper right-hand photograph. Now we broke apical dominance. And what did the tree do? Exactly what you told it to do. Get bushy, and it started growing right back into the tree. Now, are these strongly attached, all those little branches, soon to become tree trunks? No, they're all very weakly attached, and there's a cone of rot inside the stem, or will be in short order. Who kind of heard tick, tick, tick in their head? Yeah, this particular tree has now become a hazard and will become more hazardous as those limbs get bigger at the pruning cut, which is just under those power lines or electric line or cable line, whatever that may be. I don't know what these people were thinking. They have some beautiful trees. Maybe it was too shady and that was causing their lawn to die out, and so they decided to get more sunlight down there. I couldn't exactly explain it to you. This is an extreme. Occasionally we have people calling and saying the guy removed all but a few of the limbs. That's called topping or hat racking. These trees are extremely dangerous at this point, or will be as they regrow and resprout. Also notice a mulch that has been piled around the trunk of the trees. I'm not sure what they're trying to do to help this tree with all that mulch. Obviously nothing. So you may have heard of hat racking. That's just leaving a few large limbs and no branches left and pretty much no foliage. If you ever see a business that advertises topping or hat racking or buckhorning as a service, move on. So here's what happened inside these trees that were hat racked or topped or buckhorned. You can see where new branches came out. Here in this case we have only two out or three that we can see in the cross section, or the longitudinal cross section. You can see only a small living bit of conductive tissue remains just under the bark. As long as that remains intact, the tree can keep on living. That doesn't mean it's healthy, or that doesn't mean it's not a hazard to you and your neighbors. Would you want big limbs over your house with that kind of rot in it? Pruning shrubs. By and large, most shrubs aren't pruned, they're hedged. And most hedged shrubs don't tolerate it over the long haul. They're the wrong plant to be treated as a hedge or sheared shrub. Remember, shearing is a type of heading cut. What does heading tell the plant to do? Yes, branch out, become bushy, become dense. Now, in some cases, that may be the desired necessity for that particular plant. And of course, shearing can create all sorts of whimsical forms like the upper left-hand photograph. I don't find that particularly attractive, but I suppose with that interesting architecture of that building, it might work. Just doesn't need to apply in my yard. That's way too much fuss. Of course, shearing it creates that very formal look. We'll see this in a lot of walled gardens, especially in England. A lot of our roots come from England initially in this country, and we kind of kept up with those ideas of, these plants have to be sheared in order to have a landscape. And again, these are all in the lower picture, like flat top haircuts. I'm sure they are paying someone quite a bit of money to do this probably every few weeks. In Florida, it'd probably be every 2 or 3 weeks in the dead of summer. So hedges, those that are good candidates for shearing, choose those that are evergreen with small dense leaves. Short internodes, we talked about internodes, the space between the leaves, and dense branching, and able to sprout from old wood. Arborvitae, which is naturally kind of a gumdrop shaped tree with time, or evergreen, if you prune it and you prune into the brown tissue, it will not resprout from that area, it will remain dead. Keep the number of hedges to a minimum because they are labor intensive. A lot of people think it's easier to just run the gas powered shear over them, but you're doing it all the time. This is partially fact and opinion, I suppose. If a plant needs to be pruned several times each year to control the size, it is probably the wrong plant for that location. Yet I see people doing this all the time, or paying people to do it all the time, or writing contracts for their particular community to shear the shrubs on a monthly basis in the summer and maybe 2 or 3 times in the winter. Possibly the long-term solution in some of these plants that are starting to look pretty poorly or fail is to eliminate the need for that kind of pruning altogether. There are dwarf cultivars of some of our plants, some of which are native plants. Ilex vomitoria. We talked about Ilex earlier in the botany module. You'll recognize that as a genus of holly. In this case, Ilex vomitoria. Don't eat too much of this one, kids. Anyhow, Ilex vomitoria, cultivar Nana. Nana is a typically used cultivar name meaning dwarf or small. We see this one used time and time again. So there's a particular form of Ilex vomitoria that remains small. In fact, it will look like a perfect evergreen meatball if left alone and not pruned. Just usually the objective a lot of people want anyhow. Something other than a woody shrub may be better for a foundation plant, or for that matter a parking lot plant. Usually when people say I want a shrub, I say how tall do you want it to be, and they say, oh, I want it to be short. And I say how short, and they say 1 foot. Well, maybe an ornamental grass like muhly grass. Well, that's about a foot when it's got leaves and about 3 feet tall when it's flowering. Maybe that'll work. Maybe that's too tall. Maybe something like liriope, evergreen giant being one particular cultivar that grows about 18 inches. There are different ways to get foundation plants. It's not always woody shrubs that should be called upon. Then people get creative of pruning. I'm not sure what he was thinking, but the point I'm trying to make is that's a lot of work getting up on a ladder trying to prune or do this a lot. I don't think this photograph is real, but I did read a story of about 15 years ago where a man who was tired of shearing his shrubs with a hedge clipper, electric or gas, decided to one day use his lawnmower. And he must have had an old one without all the safety equipment, and he picked it up underneath and tried to lift it up and then mow the hedges down. Needless to say, he lost his fingers in the process. And we wonder why we don't live as long as women, guys. So shearing is a telling the plant to do what? That's exactly right. Being a heading cut, you know that where there once was one branch, there's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever number, depending on that particular plant species or cultivar. Now, if you need to get the plant thicker or bushier, then maybe that's the right pruning technique. But after several seasons of cutting that, and usually to the same place or within the same few inches of the original hedging or shearing, usually you get kind of this branchy, ugly pattern. So what can we do to keep the plant from growing tall so fast? Right, the drop crotch. Told you it wasn't a bad expression. Embrace it. Why did they name it that? I don't know. I wasn't there. But again, we bring the cut down to a crotch, and the new growth is going to be forced primarily on to just only a couple of stems instead of many, many. And that can also be future drop crotch. Now this is squeezing the bloom more or less downward, keeping these shrubs shorter, longer. Again, is that quick to do? Is it easy to do? Remember, this costs time and money and also needs knowledge how to do it properly. Remember back to my father and my discussion about pruning the shrubs around his house years ago? Yep. A couple of places. Now, this one doesn't show that V shape so much, but they were shearing the sides probably so students or whoever could sit at these benches. Now, if you see rubbing or crossing branches, that would be where the bark would rub off, and that potential of those both stems or branches could start to die or decline, or disease issues get in from the wounds that would create. Variegated plants are notorious for reverting back to the green. Remember, variegation is not advantageous out in the grand scheme of photosynthesis because these leaves are only photosynthesizing at maybe 50% capacity of that little revert that's completely green. So the plant all of a sudden goes, I can produce a lot more food if I produce more of this green stuff. But humans like to maintain these cultivars, variegated cultivars. We know what a cultivar is now, right? And these reverts happen. And a lot of times people will plant a variegated shrub because of the color and it's very interesting. And they'll shear it. And what will happen is these reverts will keep on getting bigger and bigger and overtaking the variegated portion. You actually literally have to get in there with a hand clipper or loppers if it's a bigger diameter plant like a pittosporum and remove it all the way out till you can see it's back to variegation. Because the original variegated plant was one particular branch that kind of was like this green one, an oddball in the mix. But humans said, I like that, decide to clone it, usually in this case of this particular plant by cuttings, and maintain it as a cultivar of this particular species. They paid an expert to have this work done? Boy. Yep. And here in the parking lot of one of the very popular places in town, we see this time and time again. And it frustrates me as a person and definitely as a professional. If you don't know what the heck you're doing, please don't get into this particular job profession. Discredits all of us, those that actually know what they're doing, those that have studied it, those that are arborists. Be careful of who you hire is what the slides are trying to say. It's easy enough to go down to the copy shack and get a magnetic sign that says Bubba Javes tree trimming service. Hopefully some of you Jeff Dunham fans picked up on that. Let's conclude part 3 of pruning and join me in module 4.